the government has narrowed its growth forecast for this year to 2 to 3% from 1 to 3%. That is as the country extends its growth in the second quarter to just below 3%. The final read for the June quarter came in at 2.9%, confirming the preliminary estimate. It is a faster pace of growth than the 2.7% predicted by economists polled by Bloomberg. Now, that performance was primarily driven by wholesale trade as well as the finance sector and the infocoms industry. Consumer-facing sectors such as retail trade and F&B shrank with an increase in outbound travel by locals. Manufacturing also slowed, largely due to a contraction in the biomedicals cluster and a sharp fall in pharmaceuticals output. But the electronics cluster returned to growth, supported by strong demand for smartphone, PC, and AI-related chips. On quarter, GDP grew 0.4%, unchanged from the first quarter. Looking ahead, external demand is expected to be resilient for the rest of the year, helping to buoy Singapore's economic growth. But downside risks remain, including geopolitical conflicts and disruptions to the global disinflation process. Singapore's manufacturing sector is expected to see a gradual recovery in the second half of the year, particularly for electronics and chemicals, and a continued recovery in air travel and tourism will support growth in accommodation and air transport. Let's bring in Yun Liu now, ASEAN Economist at HSBC, to help us break this all down. Yun, good to have you on. Let's talk about that final reading there for Singapore's Q2 GDP coming in 2.9%, unchanged from advanced estimates. What do you make of this print? I mean, this also follows Q1's revised growth rate of 3%, so not very much has changed.
That's right. I mean, if we look at the final GDP print of the second quarter here, there have been no change to the headline numbers. But actually, if we look at the breakdown here, I think there is a downward revision in the manufacturing sector. But fortunately, the resilience in services sector, I mean, especially in domestic-oriented services, can offset part of the weakness in the manufacturing sector. And even for the manufacturing sector, I think we're still seeing quite a lot of the good momentum here in terms of the electronic sector, the upturn, really riding on the upturn of the tech cycle. So I think for Singapore here, I mean, really has made quite a lot of good progress. I mean, last year around the same time, we're still talking about the possibility of a technical recession. And fast forward to today, Singapore is seeing quite decent growth of around 3% year over year in the first half of this year.
Right. I just want to drill down to some of the details in this report as well. So the growth was driven mainly by wholesale trade, finance, IT and comms, but as you talked about as well, manufacturing shrank, retail, trade, F&B also shrank. What do you make of the uneven recovery across the sectors, especially with manufacturing and consumer-facing sectors shrinking is a cause for concern? I am aware that, compared to Q1, where we had the boost from that one-off tourism, the series of high-profile concerts, this is not something that, can be repeated as in subsequent quarters.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the tourism or travel-related services here, it's put down from the first quarter. But I mean, it's not every single day that you're going to have a Taylor Swift's concert economics. So I think that's also in line with expectation. But there's still quite a lot of potential there. I mean, in terms of further room to grow. When we look at the tourism flows here, it's still quite decent. And really, I think in the second half of this year, there's still a busy lineup of events. I mean, we're not only talking about concerts here, but we're also talking about a lot of MICE events here, including F1. So I think there's still reasons to be more optimistic for the second half.
Right. And I think that is what we're actually seeing as well. The Trade and Industry Ministry today's narrowing its growth forecast for the year to between 2 and 3%. That's from between 1 and 3%. So your expectation on whether Singapore can meet this forecast, what could derail this growth trajectory?
So actually last month we just upgraded our GDP forecast to 3%. So actually at the upper end of that official forecast range. And as I mentioned, I think, in terms of the services travel-related services, there's still quite a lot of good momentum. And especially in the manufacturing sector, I believe that we will likely see more of the recovery, the stronger boost coming from the trade recovery in the second half. So I am quite optimistic in the second half of this year. But obviously, in terms of the downside risk, we need to be very mindful for the trade recovery and how sustainable it can be, how broad-based it can be. I think that's quite key.
Yeah, I think, U.S. growth that is expected to slow this year. China is set to expand at a slower pace, but Europe growth is expected to pick up. How is it likely to affect Singapore's external demand outlook?
Well, I mean, indeed, we're seeing quite a lot of downside risk stemming from the trade tensions, stemming from geopolitical developments here. But I think at the same time, there are also upside risk to growth as well, especially in terms of the recovery in the electronic cycle. And I mean, really, if you look at Singapore, compare Singapore to regional peers like Taiwan and Korea, Singapore's electronic cycle is still lagging behind others. So I think in terms of that recovery, there is still quite good momentum.
All right, Yoon, appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us, Yoon Liu, ASEAN Economist at HSBC.